absolutely right with that. And I'll let you continue. I know that we got a little bit off track of what I wanted to comment on what you had said, but I think you were saying you wanted to talk about the experiments. Was that it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And this kind of goes into later, I understood, oh, this is MK Ultra. Of course, when I was going through it, I didn't know the names for any of these things. It was just what was happening to me. But there were many kinds of experiments where like I would have this metal helmet placed on my head and it had wires coming out and attached to some machinery. Um, there was an instance actually when they were doing that, and I concentrated really hard and I fritzed some of the connections. They sparked and they had to sort of stop it at that particular moment. But a lot of things where I would have to, they had these like, they had virtual reality, and this was in the 70s, right? So these things that you wear, like a big mask and things that they play and audio stuff. I would be made to say really, I would be told I had to say these really horrible things about myself into a, you know, a cassette tape recorder, what they used back then. And then they would play that and make me listen to it with headphones. So it would be like my own voice programming me to tell me how awful I was and this and that. Some of the experiments were I guess psychological, but horrific. I was always wanting, I would see this girl that I would say was my friend. So she wasn't corporeal, but I think I had some, you know, psychic ability. I did have psychic ability. So I would see this girl that I would kind of would give me comfort, and she would be like with me. And I said that, you know, in my innocence. So you know, there was a time when my uncle put me, the facility had a bunch of rooms, and they had 2 or 3 walls that were completely glass so that the scientists could watch, you know, what was going on in there. All the rooms had drain holes on the floor with hoses to hose off, you know, blood and guts. This particular room had a ceiling to floor fan, big fan. Anyway, he had said if I did something, he would bring a girl to play with me. And so I was all excited, and I saw him walking down the hall with a girl towards the room. And right before they got there, the fan went on and he pushed her through. And so she splattered all over me. And I'm sorry, I know this is really horrific, but this is what they do. And that was to show me, you know, I'll never have anyone. I'll never have comfort. I'll never have a relationship. He inculcated in me that it's my fault that all these people die. And I did believe that for a while. He would capture gypsies because in Rome, they're undocumented. So there's going to be, you know, no one's going to miss them. He would kidnap them and bring them into the facility and do all kinds of tortures and things. And so there was another point where he had captured this woman who had 2 twin babies. And I was supposed to go through this long obstacle course and figure out how to get from here to the other side with the babies in my arms. And it's hard to describe. It's like a long rectangular room with windows. So the mother would be looking through the window, and I would be like, have to go through a pit filled with cockroaches, or like, you know, these things, and climb things. And basically he said, if you make it to the end with the 2 babies, then I'll give them back to the woman. So that was my motivation. I was like, I'm going to save these babies. Well, at the end, it opened into this huge aviary. I mean, you know, stories high, and there were vultures there in there. And of course, they had been not fed. So by the time I got to the end, exhausted, I could not prevent the vultures from getting the babies, you know, and tearing them to pieces. So, yeah. So again, then he would tell me, well, you know, it's your fault. You could have saved them, and you didn't. there would be experiments of impossible choices. So he had this bigger room, again, still with the drain hole, and just empty concrete room. And he brought in like 10 or 12 people, they're gypsies. And that one was a little girl with her mom, and the rest were adults. And he had a gun and a desk there. And he said to me, you either shoot one of them or I'm going to shoot all of them. Right. So I said, no, I'm not going to kill anyone. And he said, he would pick up the gun and say, well, I'm going to start shooting him. And I said, no, I'll shoot one, you know. And then I was going to shoot one person. He said, you have to shoot that one. And it was the mother. And I thought, no, you know. So anyway, I thought, okay, I'm gonna do it because I want to save the other people. Again, this impossible choice. So I shot her, and then her daughter's face, you know, and I couldn't bear it. So I shot the daughter too, just like for me, it was an act of mercy. And you know, then he said, oh, you did it wrong, you failed. And then he took the gun and shot them all anyway, you know. And, you know, would lock me in the room again overnight with all of them, and their blood kind of draining down into the drain hole in the center. So things like this, you know, they're experiments to break me, and he would tell me, I'm gonna make you just like me. I'm going to make you just like us. And then he would say, you're a killer. You killed, you know, even though it was set up that way. And, but I have to tell you, Emma, when I heard him say, I'm going to make you just like me, something in me vowed, it was like a steel core that developed in me. And I was like, no, never. And he shouldn't have said that, because that was something that kept me going. And I used everything that I had to stay alive and to get through that, and to never turn to the dark. So he made a great mistake in telling me that. That actually became like this little core of me that was really, really strong and kept me going, because I said, no, I will never, you know.
Oh my gosh, that's so horrific to think about. And then witnessing that, like at any age, you know, but a child, and then thinking about just how, like you said, how ruthless and vile your uncle was to just, you know, be so psychotic that he has no shame in doing any of this. You know, were there other children there besides you, or was this just something that he did with you?
Well, he did it with me, but he sometimes had other children there. There was this little boy that was older than me that he had brought in, again, a gypsy boy. And we were in one of the rooms, and the guys were watching, and he gave the boy a gun, and he said, you either kill her or I'm going to kill you. And I remember he was sobbing and crying, and I was like right there with him. And I said to him, you know, it's okay. Like, you can go ahead and shoot me, you know, like, do whatever you need to do. And then he was saying, no, I can't do it. And so he refused. He threw the gun across the room. And then my uncle came in and asked for a knife and just sliced his neck open. But when he was dying, he was looking at me and I was looking at him. And I understood in that moment that he had just graduated, because he had made the right choice. He wasn't going to do that. So that was kind of, I tried to hang on to any kernel of hope that I could. And often in the facility with the people that he was killing or torturing, I would lock eyes with them and I would like connect with my heart, just because I had this idea that I don't want them to die alone or thinking, you know. So I would do my best to have little moments of connection within that horrific reality.
Oh my goodness. It reminds me of this one book that I read before called Man's Search for Meaning. by a guy named Viktor L. Frankl, and he
Yes.
talks about that. And that book really changed my life because, we go through life and we suffer, and obviously you suffered on this whole different level. But for people who never read that book, he experienced life in the Holocaust and was at a concentration camp and was one of the few that lived through concentration camp after concentration camp, and later wrote a book about this exact thing that Max is talking about, where he said, I had to find a meaning in my suffering. I had never been challenged to do that before. Like usually we just sulk in our suffering, it passes, but what about when it doesn't? What about when you're just in this perpetual cycle of suffering? And he would notice the people that gave up hope and didn't have that thing, that little morsel to hold on to, he could almost predict who would die in the concentration camp. And so he had to find a meaning in his suffering. And he said, we have to find just as much meaning in our suffering as we do in the things that are good. And he gave this quote, and I'll read it. It says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is a power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So even if it's just that morsel, like that morsel eventually led to your freedom. It was something that you could hang on to, even though it was so vile. Like you have this murderer, this psycho telling you that you're going to be just like him, and somehow that at such a young age you held on to and were like, this is going to be my motivation. When I don't want to keep going, I'm going to hold on to this, and I'm going to remember that I'm never going to be like him. And I love that you brought that up, because I think that's what survivors do. You find those morsels. You guys are so good at finding just that little flicker, that little star in the dark, and hanging on to it for dear life. And thank God that you did. Thank God he said those words to you and that they elicited that response, because I think for people that didn't take that, it could have done the opposite and like really propelled them into darkness further.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, and another moment, like a little moment of victory for me, there was a time when the facility was under the ground, and they had this like big sort of, I don't know, heating duct, and it was being repaired and there was this one kind of utility room, and I saw that it was being repaired, so it was open. And he had just brought in some gypsies that he had kidnapped. There were 3 or 4 adults. And he walked away for a minute, and I saw my opportunity. So I said to them, come, run. So I showed them the duct, and they went and climbed up it, and I was behind them. And we were able to get to there was like a white van parking lot up on the top. So it was very nondescript. And I knew, because I'd been taken there so much, that there was a part of the chain link fence that was dislodged from the bottom. So they made it out, and I pointed to the fence, and they got out. They actually escaped. And then he was coming out from the front and running towards me. And then I turned and ran towards him because, there was no way for me to escape, right? So, but I felt so good that I had let 3 of them escape. And shortly after, he kidnapped this gypsy that was an older woman. She was kind of like a grandma. And I remember like her skirts and everything. And she was in the facility, and he sometimes, would do tortures where I would sit across a desk from someone. And she told me in a moment, she said, I heard about you. She said, you helped my people. And she told me that I was an angel. So that was another moment. And then that's actually when my uncle had me say the stuff in the tape recorder. He had her, and he was going to rip off her fingernails one by one if I didn't repeat what he said into the tape recorder. And she said to me, don't say it, don't say it. But I did, because I couldn't bear for her to suffer. And so that was a moment of connection. Of course, at the end, he shot her in the head right in front of me, because we had bonded, right? So, but I had opportunities and others, where in 1 minute or 5 minutes, I could form a bond because we were in this nightmare hell together, right? And I felt responsible because he was my uncle. you know, and he was doing things to me that involved people because he figured out pretty quickly it was much more effective to hurt other people. That destroyed me much more than just hurting me, right? But to answer your question from earlier, there were other children, particularly, so sometimes there was a room where you had cages. So I'd be put in a cage and there would be other kids sometimes. And we would be taken to these elite parties. So if you ever saw that old movie Eyes Wide Shut, I had to run out of the theater, but I saw enough to recognize they do these parties like this, all fancy and black tie. And then they would bring me and the other kids in a bus or something. And sometimes, like if it was this kind of fancy party, we would be all dressed up. And there would be, you know, different ages and boys and girls. And then the people at the party, these elites would pick pedophiles like a specific age or race or gender. So they would just select us and then, you know, take us to these rooms and do, you know, rape the kids or whatever they wanted to do. Sometimes there would be these outdoor parties like on grounds. So there would be some trees and some nature, and they would sometimes strip the kids naked or sometimes put on like some certain costumes. And then we were to run and hide in the woods because it was a hunting party and we, the children, were the ones hunted. And so it was terrifying because you knew inevitably they would find you, you know. And at the end of the evening, they would have this big party table and they would always take at least one child and, you know, sacrifice that child. I witnessed at one of these parties, somebody had a very long old-fashioned sword and they took two babies and basically impaled them on the sword alive and then were swinging it around. And I want to emphasize that they think they were laughing and drinking and doing drugs, and this was fun for these people. Yeah.
Absolutely horrific. You know, and your story validates so many other people who have said these things that just seem so out there. You know, human hunting, you know, it's like we make movies number one at the box office about that. You know, it's that one movie called The Hunger Games. You know,
Yeah.
that's essentially like a human hunting entertainment. People are in the theater eating popcorn. You know, it's like they're mimicking that, and it's so sick, you know, but and then of course it brainwashes people to think, well, that can't happen in real life. And it's like, yes, it is, you know, and at these really big estates, you know, people's massive yards and these properties that people drive by and oogle at and say, gosh, I wish I was that rich and I could live there, not knowing that right in the backyard, you know, there's children on just being, you know, just the most vile things being done to children in those woods, you know. So I appreciate you sharing these really hard things, Max. This isn't, I know it's not easy to talk about, and I'm so sorry that you had to bear witness to all of this, you know, but your voice is speaking on behalf of them. Like their deaths aren't in vain if you are able to shine a light on it. And so I appreciate you
Yeah.
talking about it because it is really hard. Now, why were you chosen for this to begin with? So you obviously, you know, you had this in your family. Did you have siblings, or like what was it? Why did you become a chosen one for all of this?
I don't know why particularly.